Okay, Gary, I've been on vacation for a while. What happened in the world the last 2 weeks?
So, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a bit of a stir. For example, in the US, Donald Trump actually called on Republicans to release some Jeffrey Epstein related files, which is kind of a big shift. Over in the UK,
How
MI5 has
how
been
is that a
warning.
big shift? What do you mean it's a big shift?
Yeah, fair question. I probably phrased that a bit too dramatically. Basically, it's notable just because it's a topic that's been kind of contentious or hush hush, and having a former president openly call for releasing certain files just gets a bit of attention.
And
It's
what
not.
what files are they thinking about releasing?
So basically, these are documents tied to the Jeffrey Epstein case that a new bill in Congress wants to declassify. Trump's now on board with that idea. And if the bill passes, it means the Justice Department would have to release those files pretty quickly. Like
So he,
within.
he just maybe realized that he's not in it, so he decided it's okay to release.
Yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. It seems like now that he's not directly involved, or maybe sees some benefit in transparency, he's decided it's a good time to support releasing those files. So,
Okay,
yeah,
go on.
absolutely. So, just to wrap that up, it's one of those things where the news is basically that he's jumped on the transparency bandwagon, which is interesting in its own right. But yeah, we'll see if those files actually get released and what comes out of it. If there's anything else you're curious about, just let me know.
Yeah, what happened in Canada in the last couple weeks?
So, in Canada over the last couple of weeks, a few notable things happened. The government managed to get a key budget vote through Parliament and avoid a snap election, which was a bit of a close call. There's also been some news about heightened espionage concerns up in the Arctic, so Canada's boosting its defenses and infrastructure there. On a different note, the Vatican returned a bunch of cultural artifacts to Canada, which is pretty significant for Indigenous reconciliation.
Oh,
And on the
for
public.
what kind of artifacts?
So these were mostly indigenous cultural items that had been held by the Vatican for a long time. They included things like ceremonial masks, traditional robes, and other culturally significant objects.
And who'd they
Re-
get returned to exactly?
they were returned directly to indigenous communities and representatives in Canada. Basically, the Vatican worked with those communities and Canadian officials to figure out exactly which nations and groups the artifacts should go back to. So they're now back with the people they originally belonged to, which is a pretty meaningful step.
Was it Catholics or Protestants that ran the schools, the residential schools?
It was primarily Catholic organizations that ran most of the residential schools in Canada, although some were also run by various Protestant denominations. The Catholic Church oversaw a significant number of them, which is why they've been a major part of the conversation about reconciliation and returning artifacts or documents.
Why did they have them at the Vatican?
Yeah, so over time, a lot of these cultural items ended up in the Vatican's collections because missionaries or church officials who were involved in those residential schools and missions took artifacts back to Europe.
Stole them, basically.
In a sense, yeah, you could put it that way.
Okay,
A lot of.
let's go on. What else happened in what happened in the United States the last couple of weeks besides Donald Trump talking about the Epstein files? What else happened?
Sure. So, aside from the Epstein files bit, a couple other things made headlines. For one, the UN Security Council actually approved a US drafted resolution about setting up some sort of international stabilization force in Gaza and talking about a path to a Palestinian state. There's also been news that the Trump administration is planning to label a Venezuelan drug cartel as a foreign terrorist group. And then.
Yeah, I heard something about the United States going to war, a regime change war in Venezuela. What's going on down there?
So what's happening is that the U.S. has taken a pretty big step by labeling a Venezuelan cartel that they say is tied to President Maduro as a terrorist organization.
And why did he label them a terrorist organization? What have they done to deserve that title?
So from the U.S. point of view, they're basically saying that this cartel is heavily involved in drug trafficking and that they're propping up the Maduro regime through those activities. By labeling them a terrorist organization, it kind of gives the U.S. more legal tools to go after them and to pressure the Venezuelan government. So it's part of a broader effort to try to push for regime change, or at least to put a lot of pressure on Maduro's government.
And I'm pretty sure Venezuela does not have nukes.
Yeah, that's right. Venezuela definitely does not have nukes. They aren't a nuclear armed country, and that's not part of the equation here.
And like
It's
how
really,
how how big is their army? Like, what is it going to be? Boots on the ground, or is this going to be more like a law and legal battle?
yeah, so Venezuela does have a sizable military, but right now it's not really about putting US boots on the ground. It's more of a legal and economic pressure campaign. So they're
Okay.
focusing on sanctions, labeling groups as terrorists, and that kind of stuff to isolate the government. It's more like a pressure campaign than an invasion scenario. So
And
yeah, more.
What's this Maduro all about? What's his angle?
So Nicolas Maduro is basically the current president of Venezuela, and he took over after Hugo Chavez passed away. His angle is that he's trying to maintain the socialist policies that Chavez put in place. But he's also dealing with a huge economic crisis, a lot of international sanctions, and a lot of political opposition, both inside and outside the country. Basically, he's trying to hold on to power and keep his government stable in the face of a lot of external and internal pressure.
Okay, so the only reason U.S. cares about that is because of the drug trade.
Well, the drug trade is definitely one of the big reasons the US points to, but it's not the only reason. There's a mix of factors like geopolitical influence in the region, concerns about human rights and democracy, and the fact that Venezuela is a major oil producer. So the
Oh,
US,
I didn't realize that.
yeah, it's definitely a bit of a layered situation. There's usually a bunch of different angles in play whenever you see something like this, and it's rarely just one reason driving the whole story. But yeah, now you got a bit more of the picture.
So, are there any other countries that are interested in Venezuelan oil?
Absolutely. Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. So other countries definitely have an interest. For example, China and Russia have been big partners for Venezuela. They've invested in the oil sector and had supported Maduro's government in various ways. So it's not just the US paying attention. There are definitely other players in the mix who are interested in that oil and the strategic influence it brings.
And geographically, Venezuela is much closer to the United States. What other countries in the Western Hemisphere are interested in that oil? Does Canada get oil from Venezuela? Probably not. Does the United States buy oil from Venezuela? Who buys oil from Venezuela?
Yeah, so historically, the US actually did import a fair bit of oil from Venezuela. But that's really dropped off a lot because of sanctions and all the political tension. Canada isn't a big buyer of Venezuelan oil, just because Canada has its own oil sands and other sources. But you do have other countries in the region like Cuba or some Caribbean nations that have had oil deals with Venezuela in the past. And then on a bigger scale, you've got countries like China that have been major buyers of Venezuelan oil. So yeah, a few different players, but in the Western Hemisphere, the US was the big buyer until all the political shifts happened.
Okay, so what do you expect the outcome to be of this economic and sanction pressure from the United States?
Yeah, so it's always a bit of a tricky guess. But generally, the US is hoping that the economic and sanction pressure will push Maduro's government into either negotiating some kind of political transition or making enough changes that things stabilize. Of course, it's hard to say if that'll work out that way. Sometimes these pressures do lead to negotiations or changes, and other times governments just dig in their heels. So we'll have to see how it plays out over time.
So, how socialist is Venezuela? Is it purely socialist, or is it semi-socialist like Canada?
Yeah. Venezuela definitely isn't purely socialist in the sense of, a full on textbook definition. It's more like a heavily state directed economy with a lot of socialist policies. So the government controls major industries like oil, and they have a lot of social programs and subsidies. But it's not completely socialist in the way that everything is nationalized or that there's no private sector at all. And yeah, Canada's got a mix of socialism and capitalism, like public healthcare, but also a lot of private enterprise. So Venezuela's kind of got its own flavor of socialism, but it's not an all or nothing scenario.
Do they have universal basic income in Venezuela?
No, Venezuela doesn't have a universal basic income. They do have a lot of social welfare programs and subsidies that were introduced under Chavez and continued under Maduro. But
So
it's not like,
why is it considered so socialist? That just sounds like Canada.
yeah, it's a fair question. Basically, Venezuela is considered more socialist because the government has a really strong role in the economy, much more so than in a place like Canada. They've nationalized a lot of industries, especially oil, and they have a lot of state owned enterprises. Plus, they've tried to implement a lot of socialist policies are on wealth distribution and price controls. So even though it's not purely socialist, it's definitely a lot more state controlled than a place like Canada, which is more of a mixed economy.
Oh, okay. All right. What else happened in international news this week?
Sure. So in the last couple of weeks internationally, a few things stood out. Saudi Arabia's crown prince just pledged nearly $1 trillion in U.S. investments, including buying a bunch of F-35 jets. So that's a pretty big deal. The UN Security Council also backed a U.S. plan for Gaza that involves an international stabilization force and a possible path to a Palestinian state. And there's been a bit of tension because the U.S. military has been hitting some drug smuggling boats in international waters, and countries like France, Canada, and Mexico are a bit annoyed about how that's been handled. So yeah,
Why are they annoyed?
yeah. So basically, those countries are annoyed because they feel like the U.S. is maybe stepping on some toes by going after these smuggling operations in international waters without a lot of coordination. They're just kind of feeling like it's a bit unilateral and that maybe the U.S. should have talked to allies more before jumping in. So it's more of a diplomatic irritation than anything else. Just countries wanting a bit more of a heads up or teamwork.
Okay, so there's no international law that says Trump can't go into international waters and kill drug lords, is there?
Yeah, so international law around maritime stuff can get a little bit complicated. Technically, countries do have the right to take action against drug smuggling on the high seas under certain treaties and agreements. But it's more about the diplomacy of it, like making sure you're not stepping on other countries' toes or causing friction with allies. So there's no hard law saying, no, you can't do this, but it's more about keeping everyone on the same diplomatic page.
Okay, let's close off with a happy, fun Canadian story.
Absolutely. Let's end on a fun note. In the last couple of weeks, Canada actually wrapped up the very first season of its new professional women's soccer league, and a team from Vancouver called Vancouver Rise took the championship.
Sweet.
Plus, yeah, it's definitely a cool bit of news and a nice positive way to wrap things up. So we'll leave it on that happy Canadian note, and if you need anything else, just let me know.
Thanks.
Absolutely.